Mr. President, I rise to express my strong support for Judge Neil Gorsuch, to say that I will proudly vote in favor of his confirmation tomorrow, and to express my confidence that history will judge this nominee to be an outstanding Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I hope he serves a long and distinguished career, and believe he will. I think Justice Neil Gorsuch will turn out to be a credit to the Supreme Court, to the President that nominated him, and to the Senate that will confirm him tomorrow. It's unfortunate that we've had quite a bit of discussion about procedure and the process that has gotten us to this vote, which will take place tomorrow afternoon. Indeed, I had a conversation with one of my Democratic colleagues yesterday afternoon as we were leaving the Capitol building. And this is a person with whom I've worked on issues and for whom I have a great regard. And I asked him how he was doing, and he said, well, okay, I'm just getting ready for the United States Senate to be forever changed. And I paused for a moment and I said, you know, how can it be that two reasonably intelligent senators of goodwill can look at the same factual situation and see it so differently? And I think my colleague did agree that indeed that's the situation that we have with what led us to our proceedings today. And indeed, I do believe that my colleagues on the other side of the issues today, the procedural issues today, are people of goodwill who are trying to do the right thing by their country, just as I have been in this issue. But let's look first of all at the candidate himself, and then I might take a moment or two to talk about what we have already done. That decision has been made. But let's talk about Neil Gorsuch, about this outstanding future Supreme Court justice who I believe will be sworn in either tomorrow or the next day. Is Neil Gorsuch qualified? Really, can anyone contest that he is highly qualified, perhaps one of the most qualified people ever to have been nominated by a president for the High Court? He has degrees from Columbia, Harvard Law, from Oxford University. He has received the American Bar Association's highest rating, the gold standard that we look at when it comes to judging nominees for the federal bench, up to and including the High Court. And he served for 10 years with distinction on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And so clearly he's got the qualifications, and clearly he is among that group of qualified individuals that the president promised to look at back during the campaign, and promised to send that type of individual forward to the Supreme Court. So I really don't think there's much that can be said to contradict the fact that Neil Gorsuch is qualified and highly qualified. So now let's ask, is Neil Gorsuch somehow out of the broad judicial mainstream? And again, I think it is clear that based on his history, based on his testimony, and based on his rulings up until now, he is part of the broad judicial mainstream that will put him in good company on the Supreme Court, and makes him a worthy successor to Justice Scalia. First of all, he's earned the praise of both conservatives and liberals. He's even won the endorsement of President Obama's former acting Solicitor General, who wrote in the New York Times, quote, "If the Senate is to confirm anyone, Judge Gorsuch, who sits on the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit in Denver, should be at the top of the list." So thank you to the former acting Solicitor General for going beyond ideology and political philosophy and saying a true statement that Judge Gorsuch is outstanding and should be at the top of the list. Editorial boards across the country have touted Judge Gorsuch's credentials and temperament. The Denver Post, his hometown newspaper, wrote an editorial praising his ability to apply the law fairly and consistently. And of course, there has been newspaper after newspaper from the right and left across this country who come down on this side of the issue saying that Judge Gorsuch should be confirmed. But let's look also, and this has been pointed out so often that you wonder if you should say it again, Mr. President, but this Judge Gorsuch on the 10th Circuit has participated in 2,700 cases. He's written over 800 opinions and has been overruled by the Supreme Court one time. Is this a judicial radical? I think not. I think this is someone that is demonstrated to be in the judicial mainstream. One reversal by the Supreme Court out of 800 written decisions and 2,700 votes cast on panels with the 10th Circuit. He's almost always been in the majority. Some 99% of the panels he served on, he was in the majority of those opinions, and 97% of those decisions were unanimous. So this is hardly some radical pick, as some might have suggested. Now, has the process been unfair? And we've heard a lot about this. A lot of my dear friends on the other side of the aisle feel aggrieved, for sure. They feel that Judge Garland, the nominee of President Obama in 2016, was treated unfairly. And I would simply make this observation, and the American public can decide if this was unfair. This is a vacancy that came up during a heated, hotly contested presidential year. And there is really no doubt that under similar circumstances, had the roles been reversed and had a Republican tried to nominate a nominee in the last year of his 8-year term, that a Democrat majority in the Senate would have done exactly as we did. And I'm not guessing when I say this, because the Democratic leaders of previous years have said as much. No less than Joe Biden, who was a former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, later on became vice president for 8 years. No less than Joe Biden said exactly the same. It almost became the Biden rule. Republican presidential nominees taken up during the final year of a term will not be considered by a Democratic Senate. And so the shoe was on the other foot, and we acted the same. So we'll leave it up to the American people to decide whether Judge Garland was treated unfairly. I do not believe he was. As a matter of fact, I felt very comfortable, Mr. President, during 2016 saying, who fills a Supreme Court seat is so important, such a significant and long-lasting decision, that the American people deserve to be heard on this issue. And I felt comfortable making the presidential election largely about what the Supreme Court would look like. in coming years. And there's no question about it. The American people got to decide in November of 2016 whether they would like a judge in the mold of Justice Scalia, whose seat we were trying to fill, or would they like a judge in the mold of Judge Garland, who President Obama was seeking to put in place. So I make no apology for saying to the American people, you get to decide in this presidential year what sort of Supreme Court you want. And the American people made that decision, and I'm comfortable with that. I was asked today by several members of the press about the change in the rules that I voted for today. It's not a situation that makes me overly joyed. It's not my idea of a good time to overrule a precedent and to substitute another one in its place. You'd rather not do that if you're a United States senator. But the fact is that it puts us back into a place that we were for 200 years in this republic. From the beginning of this Congress, of this Senate, 1789 through 1889, through 1989, up to and including 2003, there was no filibuster at all on Supreme Court justices. There was no partisan filibuster at all on Supreme Court justices. And no judge had ever been denied his position because of a partisan filibuster at any level, federal judge, circuit level, or Supreme Court. That changed in 2003, and with the Miguel Estrada nomination, our Democrat friends stopped a qualified judge from going on the Federal Appeals Court. That was the beginning of an unfortunate 14-year experiment in judicial filibusters. It's not a filibuster that I think it's not a precedent, it's not an experiment that I think this Senate can be very proud of. But it took place over a relatively short period of time, over 14 years, and it ended today. As of today, the United States Senate is back where it was for over 200 years in the history of this Senate and the history of our republic, without the ability to stop a judge on a partisan filibuster. And in fact, this fact cannot be contradicted. There has never been in the history of our country, even in this past decade and a half of having the possibility of a Supreme Court filibuster, there's never been a Supreme Court nominee, the history of our republic, stopped by a partisan filibuster. And today, that 225-year or so precedent would have ended had we not acted to change the rules back to where we're back to fundamental principles. And I was not willing to see Judge Neil Gorsuch be that first nominee stopped by a partisan filibuster in the history of our country. I was simply not willing to do that. So we now must proceed to the rest of our business. We will confirm Judge Gorsuch tomorrow. I think he'll serve well, and then we've got work to do. We've got other nominees to consider, and then we've got an agenda that we need to tend to for our people. I'm encouraged, I think, by the exchange of first early steps of goodwill after this divisive process. Indeed, there was an article in one of our publications today that talked about a healthy feeling now in both caucuses that we've got to put this procedural episode behind us, this crisis behind us, and legislate. I'm glad to hear that sort of bipartisan talk coming from the other side of the aisle. Another of my friends across the aisle said, we're not looking for dilatory procedures. When there are things we can work together, we're looking for that. So I'm encouraged, and I'm encouraged that even my friend who I was talking to yesterday afternoon will conclude that we have not forever changed the Senate in a negative way, that we're in fact back to where we were before 2003 and getting things done. So in the end, this is about an individual that's qualified. It's about a vacancy that needs to be filled. And I, for one, am highly comfortable that the President in Neil Gorsuch has put forward an outstanding, eminently qualified judge, and that he will serve us well. And my vote tomorrow in favor of confirmation will be cast enthusiastically and proudly, and I think that it will stand